Evil Dead is a strange franchise. The first film came out 40 years ago, with Ash Williams and his friends staying at the wrong cabin in the woods, discovering the Book of the Dead. One by one, his friends were possessed, attacking Ash, until he finally burned the book and brought that mess to an end. Sort of. 4 years later, we got a sequel, but Evil Dead 2 was also famously kind of a remake. It once again features Ash Williams in what is essentially that very same cabin, but a different combination of characters arrive in a different order. Both feature evil tree tentacles, the girlfriend, the chainsaw, the destroyed bridge, and, of course, the Book of the Dead. The real change wasn't so much the premise or the plot, but the effects done in individual scenes. These movies have a playful, inventive relationship with the art of filmmaking, where you get a sense that the creators are more interested in what they can pull off, or what they can get away with, than the story they're telling. Up next was Army of Darkness, which has a shockingly short runtime of just over an hour, if you exclude the credits. But it did give us an anachronistic Ash yelling about his boomstick at confused medieval peasants. And macro fodder. But anyway, come 2013, the series was finally revisited. And how'd they choose to handle that? Well, another remake, of course. Evil Dead 2013 was a more traditional horror movie than the previous entries, but boy, oh boy, is this iteration completely joyless. Which is a strange thing to say about an Evil Dead entry. It's impressive in its own ways, but I just don't get why they felt the need to make it so unnecessarily bleak. It also put the series in the absolutely baffling scenario where 3 out of 4 films seem to carry the same premise, in the same setting, and nearly the same story beats. The tree tentacles, the chainsaw, the Book of the Dead. You get it. I'm not saying this is necessarily a bad thing, but it is very funny. And it was made even funnier by the fact that a horror comedy titled The Cabin in the Woods riffed on nearly the exact same premise only 1 year earlier. So by now we were getting extremely familiar with the idea of a bunch of young adults going to a cabin in the woods with an evil basement and a road that collapses behind them. I'm sorry? My script seems to say a decade later? That can't be right. The Evil Dead remake can't be 10 years old already. Can it? Oh god. Movies that came out before the pandemic are going to be 5 years old this year. This is all to say that when Evil Dead returned once again a decade later, I thought they were really going to do it. When the movie opened with that classic ghost vision closing in on yet another cabin in yet another woods. But Evil Dead Rise was pulling a goof. That drone footage turned out to actually be, well, from a drone. In fact, don't worry about these characters. They're in a cold open. They don't really matter. Instead, we'll be following the cursed fates of a pregnant woman, her sister, and her sister's 3 kids, 2 daughters and a trans boy. And if you're paying any attention, you just went, huh, because that stands out a bit. It's still fairly uncommon for the protagonist of a film not to be a dude, but not having a single cis male actor in the entire main cast? Huh. I can see where the instinct comes to modernize, though. Let's talk about gender in Evil Dead. Rewatching the original movie, things start to get a bit uncomfortable. The first major attack is Cheryl being sexually assaulted in the forest, resulting in her changing into something monstrous. And then, one by one, all of the other women also turn into monsters, justifying a great deal of violence against them. This is where, I suppose, a conversation can be had about whether this is simply depiction or commentary. After all, this is a film that goes to great lengths to depict the brutalization of women's bodies, whereas when Scott gets attacked, it happens entirely off camera. There are times where it seems that, even as Deadites, the women receive more damage than they ever put out. Oh, and one of the ways of defeating them is to penetrate them from behind, which causes, a white liquid to spew out of their every orifice? This happens twice. Counterintuitively, however, one might instead read this film as sympathetic to the Deadites, despite their role as villains. After all, Scott is openly misogynist from minute 1.
It's probably just some animal.
An animal? An animal? That is the stupidest thing I ever heard of. Hey, what'd you do that for? It was just getting good.
I just don't want to hear it anymore. That's...
Scott, come on. Roll the ball, man.
Scott, you knew not to play that. You knew it was upsetting you. You just don't know when you're taking something too far.
She's nuts. She acts like she's 3 years old or something.
When Cheryl is assaulted and returns to the group, sobbing in her torn clothes, the men don't take her seriously. She has to beg Ash to take her away from there.
Ashley, will you drive me into town or not?
What, right now?
And when they can't leave, her experience changes her. She's locked away in the basement by the men, a thing to be shamefully hidden away rather than understood. It's potent symbolism, whether it was intended or not. Though I do feel like we could have done without depicting the tree penetration. But what really stands out next is when Linda is possessed. For a long time, she doesn't seem to really do anything. She just sits there on the floor, laughing. And despite making no moves to threaten anyone, Ash starts beating her over and over again, and then he grabs a gun. Throughout this scene, the camera frames Linda's perspective, with Ash towering over her. The only thing that stops him from firing is when she returns to behaving exactly how he wants her to. Only after he abandons her back to those very woods that started it all does she finally attack. The largely consistent gender split is maintained even in the stories we don't get to see. In the recording that sets everything off, the archaeologist's wife is possessed, and he laments that he has no choice but to dismember her. Now would be a good time for you to think back through every movie you've ever seen about demonic possession. What was the gender of the possessed? Can you even remember examples where they were men? If you can, that's what, one among dozens? It's a bit unnerving once you recognize that there's essentially an entire genre of horror that's all about a spiritual war over women's bodies. First, some dastardly outside influence results in her acting up. But once that happens, there's a whole patriarchal institution that's dedicated to making sure she goes back to acting right. The struggle at the core of this conversation is in determining whether a possession story is progressive or regressive. Is it doing a feminism? Or more specifically, does the film focus on the possessed woman's agency, lost and regained, or are the church and the demon instead merely fighting over control over her body as part of a larger turf war? So with all of this in mind, is Evil Dead commenting on violence against women, or merely reproducing it? I suppose the question is, if this is what the film is doing, is it effective? How did you feel watching the original Evil Dead? Did it fill you with confused, conflicted feelings about the Deadites? Or did you just think, wow, Ash sure is having a bad day? I'm going to drop what is probably my hottest take of the video here, but this is actually why I prefer the first movie over the second. Evil Dead 2 is probably a more refined, impressive production, but I just don't find the style of comedy in either of the sequels to be all that engaging, and they're not the ones that I find myself continually thinking about after I'm done. Interestingly, though, in the part of Evil Dead 2 that sort of recaps/rewrites the events of the first movie, Deadite Linda doesn't even really get a chance to attack Ash at all. He's surprisingly ready to decapitate her on sight. The rest of the film is such a fever dream filled with Looney Tunes logic that I'm not left with much to say, but maybe that's just me. This version of Ash is starkly different, having switched from being kind of a dweeb to being this instantly iconic 80s action hero that spouts one-liners left and right.
Groovy.
Groovy.
Come get some.
Come get some.
Hail to the king, baby.
Hail to the king, baby.
In Army of Darkness, he's kind of a huge prick, though the movie doesn't feel like it's entirely on his side either. He keeps pumping out quotes, but he also spends a lot of the film being the guy who just wants to get away, repeatedly reminding us that he doesn't care about the mission to save the world and is only cooperating so that he'll be sent home. By this point in the series, he has basically replaced Scott as the man who has weird attitudes concerning women.
First you want to kill me, now you want to kiss me. Blow.
You found me beautiful once.
Honey, you got real ugly.
Just like in the first movie, the lone female character once again becomes a Deadite when she is assaulted. But this time, the villain who does this is a clone of Ash that's split off from him, implied to consist of his darker urges.
What are you? Are you me?
I'm bad, Ash. And you're good, Ash. You're a goody little two-shoe.
Good. Bad. I'm the guy with the gun.
So, when that part of Ash does that to her, Perhaps more explicitly than ever before, Ash is made complicit here. There's a certain term for this through line right here. 2 words. Second word, culture. And once again we have the question, depiction or commentary? Then, of course, we have the modern remake. Once again, a woman is assaulted in the woods. Once again, she returns and sets off a sequence of events in which all of the women are possessed and killed one by one. The biggest change is that this time, this is all meant to be a trip to get the sister off of drugs, which muddies the waters considerably. Now, when everyone else is dismissing her assault, we're meant to believe that they're doing it to help her. So, on top of all of the expertly rendered gore, this element is also much more upsetting than the original. I'm just not sure that it's an improvement? I don't know. We already started the series with a woman's pain being doubted, so I'm not sure what's added thematically by having everyone say that they're doing it for her own good, and to try to frame those characters to be contextually in the right when doing so. But then we finally get to Evil Dead Rise, last year's new entry. And the main thing that I'm itching to talk about here. The main cast consists of 4 cis women and a trans man. There are also a half dozen cis male characters, but instead of running the show, they're all relegated to, at most, a few minutes of screen time each. In fact, outside of the movie, it was the casting of trans actor Morgan Davies as Danny that dominated a lot of the online discourse. Many were pleased to have a trans character who got to simply exist without his transness coming up at all in the plot. And yes, I recognize the irony in spotlighting something that is specifically celebrated for how attention isn't drawn to it within the art.
From Yellow Jackets to Heartstopper, on-screen trans storylines are increasing. However, new horror flick Evil Dead Rise has given the representation that has still been lacking. Trans morons.
And let's not mince words here. This is good. I want more female leads, and I want more LGBTQ+ characters that are played by LGBTQ+ actors. Specifically, I want this to become normal enough that instances of it happening are no longer noteworthy, and that the entire idea's merit isn't judged based on the perceived success or failure of individual projects. After all, it takes a whole lot of visibility to finally become invisible. The impact doesn't end at who gets the most screen time, however. Evil Dead as a series was too packed with gendered themes for that. By making the main cast mostly women, this changes how we perceive the Deadites, both how they are possessed and the violence that is done to them. Now that the sexual assault has been removed, the story is freed to be about something else, and that something is child rearing. Let's get the summary out of the way so that everyone's on the same page. Meet our protagonist, Beth the guitar technician. She's just learned that she's pregnant, and she's not psyched about it. So she visits her sister, Ellie, in her apartment complex. Ellie is a newly single mother with her 3 kids, Danny, Bridget, and Cassie. The kids go out for pizza, but an earthquake caves in part of this parking structure, revealing a vault that contains the Book of the Dead. When Danny reads the book, Ellie is possessed and proceeds to attack her own family. She wounds Beth and Bridget before being locked out in the hall, where she then murders every other minor character in the movie. The family is seemingly safe inside the apartment, but Bridget is corrupted by her wound and ultimately kills Danny. Possessed Ellie also manages to enter the apartment through the vents, so Beth grabs Cassie and makes a break for the parking structure. At this point, Ellie, Bridget, and Danny have all combined into a body horror amalgam. It gets a hold of Cassie, but Beth is thankfully able to feed the monstrosity into a wood chipper, allowing the two to finally leave once and for all. It's a simple story, but I ended up with a surprising amount of stuff to unpack. Let's start with, casting aside, how much the film itself takes time to signal as progressive. For example, there are a few jabs at heteronormativity. The youngest sister, Cassie, cuts the head off of a baby doll, a toy that's meant to help her roleplay being a mother. And Bridget is given a scene where she rejects the boy next door. There's even an explicit little streak of leftism in the house.
Have you seen my favorite black t-shirt? I need it for the Labor Day protest tomorrow.
With Bridget owning an Eat the Rich shirt and working on a sign for a climate change protest tomorrow.
You're not going to any protest on your own. Sophie's dad's taking us. I've told you like 10 times already.
It's not exactly subtle, but I mean, we only have like 80 minutes to work with here. But this does mean that with Ellie dyeing her hair, I can pretty definitively say that this household, in both name and spirit, has red hair and pronouns. Beth and Ellie also won't be receiving any trad wife allegations, Beth being a career-driven woman who is considering getting an abortion, and Ellie being a single mother and a tattoo artist. The family is even explicitly atheist.
May I pray?
She's not religious.
It doesn't come up much, but there is this interesting line from Beth.
Because I only believe what I can see.
Yes, they're talking about ghosts, but this is also basically the empiricist argument against the existence of God. So, this is an interesting 40-year trajectory for Evil Dead, isn't it? If nothing else, we've moved away from women as plot devices in favor of casting women as the leads while explicitly citing real-world politics as a shorthand for characterization. And these details are fine. I am happy for the people who are happy about this, but also I might be about to ruin the movie for you, because despite all it has going for it, Evil Dead Rise is very much steeped in the tropes of both its genre and its franchise, and in reproducing them, I think it stumbles. But, to be clear, despite how parts of this essay may sound, I don't grade all media I consume on some kind of political rubric and then let that determine whether or not I like a film. In fact, I kind of loved Evil Dead Rise. The cast all did a pretty good job. The horror was frequently successfully upsetting, but there was also this vicious, playful glee throughout the whole thing. Like everyone was having fun with it. Out of the 5 films, this was the one that made me laugh the most. And that's a subtle, hard-to-explain thing, because there weren't really jokes, nor were there loud comedy beats like a severed hand flipping you off, or Ash doing a Three Stooges bit. Instead, this was a movie that understood why I love horror comedies, and landed right where I wanted it to. So, yeah, don't take this video as a condemnation of Evil Dead Rise, or an accusation, but more of an autopsy. Because what I find so interesting about this film is the contradiction between how it is often received and what I think that it's actually saying. For example, the family being atheists in the story is certainly a choice, because unlike in real life, they are obviously and provably wrong. The Book of the Dead was sealed in a vault full of crosses by the church. It summons very real spiritual entities that do possess people.
Ellie waits in hell for you and your unborn bastard baby.
Hell exists, implying that so do both the devil and God. It's not a point that's emphasized, but the belief system of the entire main cast is wrong. It's worth mentioning that horror films have a bit of a history of reinforcing elements of conservative ideology. This is, after all, the genre that loves to kill off characters who have extramarital sex, and in which the final girl who survives the story is often virginal or otherwise characterized as pure. So, if we analyze Evil Dead as a story that's judging and punishing its characters, what do we find? Well, the fun mom dies because her trans kid reads a book he stole from the church, in an elevator that she's only in because her leftist activist daughter shouted at her to wash her Eat the Rich shirt. Okay, let's pull on that thread and see where it goes. It can be argued that the film thinks Ellie needs a man in her life. Danny steals the book because he thinks that Mom needs the money it might be worth.
You think it might be worth something? Mom could do with some extra money right now, don't you think?
Implying that she's not quite making it on her own. He's only there to discover it in the first place because she sends the kids out alone to get pizza because she doesn't have time to cook. Probably because she was working that day.
I'm free now. Free from all you titty-sucking parasites.
Emphasizing this point, the youngest is nearly tricked into letting the possessed Ellie back inside when she claims that Daddy is home.
What's wrong with you, Mom?
I was just feeling sad about me and your dad. But he's here now. He came home to see us. We're getting back together. We love each other. Isn't that right, my darling?
And let's talk about that song that Ellie is singing as she's locked out in the hallway.
Gold-haired girls with curling tresses, hush-a-bye, baby, babe, not mine.
It's called
Avan Uthias,
localized as O Lady Down Yonder. It's an Irish children's song, originally in Gaelic, that's a rather deceptive lullaby. Every other line is singing to the baby cradled in her arms, but those lines are alternating with pleas that are directed at another woman across the river.
Mothers who nurse with sad caresses, hush-a-bye, baby, babe, not mine.
see, she's been kidnapped by fairies who are forcing her to raise children that aren't her own, and she's begging the other woman across the stream to go find her husband so that he can save her before she's doomed to this life forever.
And let night bring to cross my sorrow, hush-a-bye, baby, babe, not mine.
I know this is the Deadite speaking, but it points to a resentment towards having to raise so many children alone, be that a guilty urge from Ellie, or a fear that Cassie has felt since the divorce. They didn't pick just any random lullaby, they chose the one about feeling trapped raising children. Beth is even more explicitly called out for having chosen her career over family. She claims that she would have helped Ellie throughout the divorce if only she'd called her, but Ellie had called her.
I called you. Twice. First time when he told me he was leaving, second the night he moved out.
But Beth was too focused on her job, hunting a historic promotion, to even notice what her sister was going through.
I'm sorry, okay? You know, when I'm on the road, I get sucked in deep, and I'm trying to make Chief Tech right now. I'll be the first woman in my crew to do it, so...
She's ambitious, trailblazing into male-dominated spaces, which is cool, but I'd argue that the film isn't exactly making a case for that being a good thing. Instead, we're only shown the cost. Once Ellie is dead, Beth is taunted by voicemails from her sister, the calls for help that she ignored.
Hey, Betty Boo, it's Ellie. Calling to say hi, and you have to help me, Beth, you have to. I'm burning alive.
Confronted with the impermeable threshold that is death, she's forced to consider what she might have done differently.
Please don't indoctrinate her into your groupie world.
What's a goopy?
Mom's favorite nickname for me, even though she knows I'm a guitar technician.
Beth is also repeatedly shamed over the perception that she sleeps around. Her sister calls her a groupie, and side characters who haven't met her do so as well, revealing that Ellie is consistently gossiping about exactly this.
Beth, Ellie's sister?
Ah, yeah. The groupie.
And, well, we don't know who the father is. She got pregnant with someone, but she never indicates who that man is. When her possessed sister continues to taunt her over this, Beth gets very emotional in her denial.
Oh man, you're like you open your legs, you stinking ruby slut! I'm not a groupie, you psycho! Bitch!
Given her overall arc in this story, it's hard not to see this as the film judging her for her past actions as a liberated woman, that her implied promiscuity is a thing that needs to be grown past. The subtext isn't kind to the kids either. There's a noticeable disparity, where Cassie looks like she was 3D printed from a generic little girl template, whereas her older siblings are, to varying degrees, more gender non-conforming. This distinction feels emphasized by the fact that Cassie ultimately needs to be saved from her family. What the hell am I talking about? Well, bear with me. So, there's this Bible passage that goes,
"Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You are not your own, for you were bought with a price. So glorify God in your body."
This passage says jack shit about tattoos and piercings, but is nonetheless frequently cited as an argument that getting tattoos or piercings is an act against God. The idea is that you were created in God's image to worship God, and that any changes that you make to your body are you polluting that image. On that note, one of Ellie's first punishments is her having her piercings ripped out. And once possessed, she attacks her oldest daughter with her tattoo gun. The tattoo would already be seen as an intrusion on her body, but Ellie takes it a distressing step further by using her own blood. This is what ultimately corrupts Bridget, turning her into another Deadite. And corrupting is definitely the word. Through the language of horror, this is where you'd expect the film to be making a point about how, in raising their kids, parents mold them in their own image, instilling them with their ideology and way of life, in this case, through abuse. When Bridget then goes on to attack and corrupt Danny, following this logic, you'd expect this to be a commentary on how abuse from parental figures is then replicated between siblings.
This horror will not stop until innocence is destroyed.
The subtext here then escalates pretty logically. Ellie, Bridget, and Danny all merge together into a single being, a family amalgam, which gives us the imagery of our protagonist saving the generic little girl from her evil mother and her older siblings that were already too far gone to be separated from her. In fact, when Beth needs to incapacitate Ellie so that she can take Cassie away from her, she uses scissors. You know, like how one severs an umbilical cord. It's a fairly on-the-nose symbol for separating a mother from her child.
Don't take me from them. You have no idea what it's like to bring a child into this world, Beth.
But in case that wasn't handled bluntly enough, Cassie even specifically disowns her mom as they leave.
I know you're not my mom anymore.
Finally, once Beth defeats the amalgam, we get this final nugget from Ellie.
You know, you really do look like Mom, and you're gonna fail miserably just like her.
This opens the story up to being not just about motherhood, but generational trauma. Sure, this is the Deadite speaking, but it's meant to screw with Beth's head, so we know that it's at the very least accurate to her own fears. We don't know whether Ellie and Beth ultimately resent their mother, or if they're sympathetic to her struggles, but we do know that they think she fucked them up. And looking at the subtextual through line that I just explored, it seems that the movie is saying that Ellie never fully recovered from this, and that she fucked up her own kids in turn, creating a toxic environment that Beth needed to rescue Cassie from. I'm not in love with the message that I'm taking away from this film. I talked earlier about how the original Evil Dead had a bit of a Me Too theme going on. A woman's assault isn't taken seriously, which results in negative consequences for all women. But in removing that dynamic in Evil Dead Rise, the subtext instead seems to be concerned with mothers, womanhood, and gender itself. The family amalgam monster makes so much sense as a metaphor for abuse that it makes me wish that this story was more explicitly about a fucked up family. But in following the trope that the child survives, being the youngest and purest among them, the film suggests that those who died were corrupted in some way. And since the film seems so otherwise concerned with gender, it's hard not to then read into how the story damns the kids that are less conforming and saves the kid that is more conforming. The problem here is that choosing not to reinforce gender norms is not abuse, and neither is trans-affirming care. To be clear, I don't think that this is what the story was going for, but I also think that if you're a Fox News viewer who went into this with phrases like gender ideology already in your head, well, the themes didn't really do anything to contradict your worldview. The film ends on the note that Ellie and Beth's mom screwed them up, having only just finished up a sequence where Ellie corrupted both of her older children, dooming them. It plays with these themes while, clumsily, having not presented us with what I'd call a dysfunctional family. Instead, it showed us one trans boy and one motivated political activist, and I don't like what it's implying there, intended or not. That sucks. If you watched my video about Annihilation, a much better movie, you know that I don't believe that much of anything in a movie is there for no reason. This is because we're dealing with an entirely curated space. The characters are invented from scratch with no real limitations on who they can be. And the actors are on a set where, more often than not, every single item that you see was chosen and placed. Acting choices, camera angles, even the editing. Everything is informed by some level of intent. A movie can be sloppy, incoherent, but it can almost never be random. So you can disagree with my points, or even my conclusion. The only thing that disappoints me is when someone just says, "Nuh-uh," or "You're overthinking it," or "It's just a horror movie." Because there, you're taking the meaning that I've extracted, throwing that away, and then replacing it with nothing, which is frankly more insulting to the filmmakers than anything that I can say. But let me point out some of the problems with the case that I've made so far. The most obvious contradiction is that the movie presents the family in a favorable light. They have a few conflicts, but all 5 characters are meant to be seen as charming, sympathetic, and endearing. They're going through a tough time at the moment, but the story doesn't paint the household as dysfunctional, nor is any individual framed as the bad actor. You could barely say that any of them even have flaws, aside from Beth not keeping up with her family, but that might be to the movie's detriment, because the thematic through line about motherhood and trauma is definitely there. So what was it trying to say if it wasn't a condemnation of the family? It feels like the movie would just be more coherent if it was more explicitly about abuse before the Deadites arrived, or if there was something more subtly and insidiously wrong with its older members. But without some additional shuffling, a more focused story would end up being about the corrupting influence of gender nonconformity, which is not what I want either. But unless we can come up with a meaningful alternative read that successfully incorporates the tattoo gun, the scissors, the amalgam, the lullaby, the comments about motherhood, and so on, I can't help but see Evil Dead Rise as a broken movie? Was it rewritten? Because the subtext of the horror elements in the second half seemed to be responding to an introduction that wasn't the one that we got. The best I can come up with is that they're all meant to represent different facets of Beth's fear of motherhood, but not only does that make it a very small movie that's focused entirely around a single character to the point where no one else matters at all, it also doesn't address about half of what I've brought up. Also, slaughtering your sister's family in order to realize that you're ready to become a mother is an incredibly strange way to handle a character arc. But perhaps that's exactly what we got. To offer a potential counterpoint, however, here's an article by Jubilee Finnegan, titled Evil Dead Rise and Queering the Family.
Early in 2023's Evil Dead Rise, we are presented with Ellie and her 3 children. They all embody a radical deviation from the expected norms of kids. These kids are queer as fuck, and I love them for it.
Okay, so it's good to know I wasn't totally hallucinating the queerness of the family. Why am I quoting a blog from the Frida Cinema in Los Angeles? Well, because I needed a fellow queer person to compare notes with, and if I have to read another Reddit thread that was downvoted into oblivion because it's just a movie, I'm going to delete my channel. Anyway, our initial observations match up shockingly well with each other. The jabs at heteronormativity, the queer expression among the kids, and so on. But their interpretation of the supernatural elements of the story is very different from my own. Ellie's family is a victim of economic hardship, which Finnegan smartly connects to the fact that the Book of the Dead is found in a bank vault, representing a financial institution.
Danny told me that when this building used to be a bank, a teller got caught stealing and hanged himself, and he scares you to death so he can take all your money.
It's true.
And is explicitly retrieved because of financial pressures.
Mom could do with some extra money right now, don't you think?
But then we diverge wildly. Finnegan interprets the Deadite attack as an expression of outside pressures, rather than a specter of the family's guilt. To them, possession is a heteronormative force inflicting violence upon the family. This, interestingly, reframes the amalgam as a homogenizing force. The stripping of queerness.
In tackling the reality of this violence, Evil Dead Rise paints a powerful image of queer resistance in the face of violence. Ellie's family goes down swinging. Even as the world looks down on them, the family of Evil Dead Rise lives on in Beth and Cassie. Rather than living based on heterosexual norms of society, they destroy the old ways. In claiming the role as victor over the Deadites, Beth slays the demon of heterosexual normality. This masculine role is placed upon the mantle of a queer woman.
I can respect this reading as a whole, but there's just one huge gaping issue in it for me. Beth isn't really much of a queer woman, is she? There isn't a ton of coding going on here. We exclusively have one big data point that she has had straight sex, and the emotional arc of the entire film is her deciding to keep her baby. Oh, right, the entire reason I started writing this. I've been a bit shaky on some of my previous points, but here is where I'm quite certain. Whether it was intended or not, Evil Dead Rise is an anti-abortion film. Let's run through it again. We open on Beth taking a pregnancy test. It's positive, and she does not wear the expression of someone for which this is good news. She is then immediately interrupted by a coworker, expressing to us that she's far too busy right now to have a child. This is reinforced when she's with Ellie, where we learn that she's been neglecting her existing family because she's so busy with her career. So, her motivation is clear. She came here to confide in her sister, seeking guidance. Will she put her career on pause to have the baby, or will she seek an abortion? But she never gets to broach the subject because evil forces spiral things out of control extremely quickly. You might be saying, hang on, the The movie never actually says abortion at any point. And you'd be right. And wrong. Beth never looks directly into the camera and says, I need to get rid of this baby, and she and Ellie never have the chance to discuss it. But the Deadites love abortion. They love taunting Beth about it, and they love threatening to do it to her. When it's revealed that Bridget is possessed, she's found chewing on and swallowing glass. It's upsetting. What would drive her to perform this act of self-destruction? Is it just random shock value, or...
I gotta kill the creepy crawlies that I got inside my tummy. I don't like having things inside my tummy. Do you, Auntie Beth?
Oh. She's doing something dangerous and damaging because she's trying to kill something that's alive inside of her. That's an out-of-hospital abortion. Like, if you don't see that, you're unreachable. She's literally taunting a pregnant woman about killing something that's inside of her. This one's just not up for debate. Danny doesn't really do anything revealing when he becomes a Deadite. He's the last to die, and by that point there's nothing left to do but join the amalgam, so there's not much to be learned there. But Ellie is possessed for most of the movie, so she gives us a lot to work with. For example, the first thing she does before anyone realizes that she's dangerous is her creepy kitchen monologue. Her words are foreshadowing the amalgam, but the whole time she's talking, she's breaking every single one of her eggs. Some eggs bleed. So here, the first thing that Ellie does after she's possessed is destroy a symbol of fertility. She then, of course, sings that lullaby, a story where I'll remind you the stakes are, please save me or I'll be forced to raise these children. But her loudest moment comes when she pounces on Beth near the end.
I will swallow your soul. 2 souls?
This line is absolutely wild. Don't get me wrong, it's a good horror beat, but it's also a supernatural being that's confirming the Christian stance that life begins at conception. She is so early in her pregnancy that she hasn't even begun to show, but we've just been told in no unclear terms that the embryo already has a soul, by a character that's a bit of an authority on the subject. This also appears to be the moment where Beth becomes certain that she's keeping the baby. Throughout the film, Cassie has come the closest to just speaking directly to the audience about the themes.
You'd be a good mom someday, honey Beth.
And here, right after the souls comment, is where she concludes Beth's arc.
Are you gonna be a mom?
Yes.
This isn't just a throwaway character moment, it's the answer to the question that was posed at the beginning of the movie. It's the whole point. And it comes right after Beth was basically forced to look at her ultrasound. I'm not even going to get into the frankly Freudian implications of them escaping down a hallway that consumes men into a chamber of rebirth that fills with blood. But this is a story that starts with a character considering terminating a pregnancy and ends with that character's determination to do the opposite. That is what Evil Dead Rise is ultimately about. So, what exactly happened here? How did this happen? My guess is that there are just a lot of existing tropes in horror movies, possession stories, and the Evil Dead franchise itself. If you give the protagonist a problem at the beginning of your story, the ending will likely be them overcoming that conflict within themselves. Characters that are seen as promiscuous or transgressive tend to die, whereas the pure, virginal, final girl survives not just through circumstance, but because of her moral superiority. If we reproduce the tropes of a genre without questioning their utility, we end up reproducing their decades-old morality. Those stories entertain, but as long as we restrict ourselves to that template, it's going to be very hard for me to agree that a story is queer. Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed my video where I woke scold Evil Dead, I guess. I recorded a longer, less abrupt ending, but I hated it, so I cut it. Perceptive viewers will recognize that I went on a rant about Evil Dead Rise on our podcast like a year ago. Some people found it interesting, but a lot of people said I was reaching or they couldn't see it, so I thought it would be fun to sit down and flesh the whole thing out. If it feels like I skipped over the other entries in the series, that's because they're not the films I really set out to discuss. Similarly, I'm aware of Sam Raimi and the impact that Evil Dead has had on the history of filmmaking, but that's just the thing. Every video I can find about Evil Dead is about filmmaking techniques, to the point where no one on YouTube seems to discuss what any of these movies are actually about. So that's what I went for. And any digression about inventive camera work would have been wildly off topic. Patreon supporters got to see this video a week early, so check that out if you want to support what I do. I'm already 4,000 words into the next script, so hopefully the wait should be much shorter this time. Oh, and as promised, we just wrapped up our Weird West season over on No Playing Games, so please check that out if you like actual plays of tabletop RPGs. Not a lot of people are watching, but those that are seem pretty into it.
How about you lay off? Tonight's not the night for that.
You looking to pick a fight, mister? You know, you mess with the bull, you get the shit beat out of you.
That's not how that goes.
That's how I'm going. So if you're going where I'm going, then your ass is grass.
No.
No? How's it go?
Can I punch him?
Yeah. So you managed to punch him in the face. That's a lot. That's enough to both shake and wound him. You clock this man and knock him flat on his ass in one punch.
Hell yeah. Mess with the Wolverine, get the... You okay?